Welcome back, ladies, fellas, men, and every variation thereupon. We're here today to take a look at and review another indie manga from an aspiring creator. I didn't expect more people to reach out to have me look at their indie projects, but you know what? I'm totally here for it. If you're working on any sort of indie project that you would like reviewed, whether that be a game, comic, animation, whatever, feel free to shoot an email to the address on screen and I will get back to you accordingly. That being said, I do want to make it very clear that I will never be accepting any form of payment for these reviews because I do intend to give my genuine opinions for better and worse. Good faith and constructive criticism can lead to a stronger product, and in the end, I do want you to be able to succeed in your endeavor. So if you're ever on the chopping block, regardless of what I say or if the bad outweighs the good, just know that I am still rooting for you. Before we dive into our indie insight, I want to give a huge shout out to these wonderful people for their continued support over on Patreon, with a special shout out to Celestial tier members Brendan Carlson, Cho Hen Shin, who has yet to choose a portrait, Stephen PD101, This One Snack, Totally Reasonable Curb, and Trey Hardy. All of these folks got to see this video early, and the Celestials may or may not have a certain spirit beast shaped gift in their future that'll be exclusive to their tier. So if you'd like to support the channel, snag a portrait for the credit scroll, and see videos early, head on over to the Patreon link below. Don't forget to like and subscribe while you're here if you like the content. It's good for small channels like mine and for the indie creators we'll be covering, since it also contributes to getting more eyeballs on their projects. So it's a 2-for-1 special. Now with Indie Insight, we're going to break this into a few sections to help me stay focused. First is a summary of the plot of the work in question, where I'll be giving you a brief overview without spoiling too much. Second will be my thoughts on the artwork, visual components, and composition of whatever it is that I'm reviewing. Third is going to focus on the writing itself, but not just the quality of the writing, but occasionally the technical aspects of it as well. From time to time there will be heavy spoiler talk if I have to go into very specific detail about something, but I will be sure to let you guys know beforehand so you can skip ahead if you want. Fourth will be words from the respective creator. This will sometimes take the form of one-on-one conversations like I had with Ethan, and other times it'll be blurbs that have been sent to me directly from the creator to be relayed to the audience. And lastly, we'll have a wrap-up section where I'll be giving my overall thoughts on a project instead of its individual components. I'm not really one to give arbitrary numerical scores to media, but I will be dropping them into arbitrary tiers based on their quality. Sitting at the top of the pyramid and the best tier you can end up in is Bark and Bite. This is basically a top tier project with little to no notes, or something so enjoyable that it has explosive potential in terms of popularity. Things in this category come with a built-in absolute recommendation. Just below that, we've got Stargazing. This basically means that I'm keeping a very close eye on this project. It may not be perfect, but it's damn enjoyable even if it has some issues that it needs to smooth out. Projects in this category are things that I would highly recommend, but maybe with an asterisk or two. Under that we've got It Exists. If your project ends up in this category, it means that it is very middle of the road, or at the very least, it's just kind of okay. Not great, but not terrible. I've seen much better, but I've also seen much worse. Things in this category are a bit more difficult for me to recommend, but tend to have the most potential for growth. Below that, we've got King's Game, which means it's definitely not good in its current state, but with some serious course correction, it could end up being at least salvageable. Projects in this category are very difficult to recommend in their current state, with very few redeeming qualities. Lastly, we have a category that I genuinely hope no one ends up in, and it is called Am I Dead Yet? This means that for whatever reason, from start to finish, this was a painful experience to get through. Like one of those situations where you know you have to get it done, but you would literally rather be doing anything else on Earth. This is the only category with projects within it that I will downright refuse to recommend to anyone. With all that setup out of the way, let's talk about today's project, Red Rapture. Written by Alexander A., we'll be starting with a brief synopsis of Volume 1. The story begins with a scene from far into the future where our principal character, Nagusa, is confronted by two angel-like guardians preventing him from gaining an audience with who they refer to as their lord. Nagusa says he is the one blessed above all men and offers to tell them his story. Nagusa is a 7-year-old boy who lives just outside the small Ethiopian town of Axum in the year 2100. He lives with his 64-year-old grandmother Maza. The two lead a relatively quiet and mundane life, but Nagusa is an inquisitive kid that seeks to further his understanding of the world around him. This, of course, includes his relationship with faith and God. He believes in God and the teachings of God, but finds himself questioning the men who are trusted to proliferate those teachings. Understandably, this disconnect has filled his head with questions like, when there's a miracle, how do we know for sure that it's a real miracle? And these questions don't come from a place of splintering faith, but just the perspective of someone who truly wants to understand. On top of the information we're given, we're told that Nagusa has recently turned 7 years old, which is an important threshold for not just him, but everyone. Through context clues, as Nagusa watches a tournament filled with superpowered beings, we can infer his 7th birthday is important because there's a chance he can awaken his quote-unquote blessing. 2 weeks later, he's faced with a situation in which a person he knows has awakened her gift, and in a bid to protect her from her father, offers her shelter. Unfortunately, this goes about as poorly as possible, with his grandmother expressing a concerning amount of prejudice toward the girl. However, when Nagusa inevitably awakens his own powers, his grandmother is forced to pivot and find a safe haven for him. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to the trio, there's someone hot on their heels that they're on a painful crash course with. With his newly awakened powers, Nagusa is suddenly faced with the harshness of the world he must now occupy as he's forced to leave his old life behind and walk a new road. If that sounds remotely interesting to you, there's a link to the project in the description below. You can skip to the end to see where my feelings ultimately land, but please keep in mind that, like I always say, art is subjective. How you feel about something may differ from me, and it's up to you to discern when to form opinions of your own. From this point forward, I'm going to be weaving in and out of spoiler territory since there are certain things I want to talk about. But first, let's hop into our words from the author. Now, Alexander and I didn't get a chance to have a sit down like I did with Ethan, but he was kind enough to send me a blurb about his journey as a creator. Since we weren't able to do the kind of sit down interview, I figured it would be best to lead with this section before we dive into my thoughts on Red Rapture itself. So, here's what Alexander had to say. My creative journey began with a simple but powerful urge to tell a meaningful story. With a natural knack for storytelling that dates back to my school days, I began shaping what would eventually become Red Rapture. Originally conceived as a light novel. Drawing inspiration from my own life, the stories I've loved growing up, and years of studying narrative structure and world building, I poured myself into the project during the pandemic, using those isolated years to construct a compelling, multifaceted world. By the end of it, I had the story completely written out and was planning on publishing it as a light novel to get started. The goal was to eventually have an anime and make a cultural impact down the line. What started as a light novel soon evolved into something more. I thought to myself, you know what, why not just turn it into a manga-esque comic, since that was the original goal, and so I did. With Red Rapture, I want to tackle many themes such as the meaning of power, the nature of humanity, faith, and what it means to take action in the face of adversity. I hope to convey these themes well to others. My creative influences include series like Naruto, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and Full Metal Alchemist, stories known for their intricate worlds, philosophical depth, and unforgettable characters. These stories shaped not only my writing style, but also my goal to create a narrative that readers can think deeply about, connect with emotionally, and remember long after the final page. What I like about stories like the ones mentioned is that they have a strong narrative that inspires you to think. I've always been drawn to stories that have deep philosophical messages and explore their themes to the max, allowing the readers to figure out the message for themselves. Then there's the world building. Nothing is more gratifying than to be able to feel a strong desire to be part of a new world. A world filled with deep history, mystery, and wonders are all of the traits that I like. On top of that, stories like Avatar and Naruto are enriched with real-world East Asian cultural references, and when you learn about them, it just adds to the experience. I hope to do something similar with Red Rapture by enriching it with various African cultural references. And then there's the characters, the important aspect that wraps it all together. I think it's not only important to have characters that you like, but it's also important that they feel real. So real that you end up cheering for them without even realizing it, and remember them for years to come. That's what I hope to accomplish with Red Rapture. As a creator of African descent, I feel an obligation to create characters that not only share my physical characteristics, but are also human. A creator who has noticed that his people want characters that not only look like them, but are living and experiencing unique and fantastical lives. They want heroes to cheer for and model themselves after, characters to inspire them or allow them to escape from reality for a brief moment. Creating representation isn't just making a black character and calling it a day. If people wanted that, they could just use AI and make millions of them. No, I believe it's about creating influence and impact, an inspirational message, a hero, and if you're lucky, a legacy. It's making a character so real that when they succeed, you're happy. When they're hurt, you feel sad for them. And when you part ways with them to read the next book, it feels like you're saying goodbye to a friend. This is what I hope to accomplish with Red Rapture. Those are very commendable but lofty goals to pursue, and I can understand the desire to create characters of your own that you see yourself in, both in physical attributes and personality. Every audience deserves to have representation, but the tricky part is doing it well. This consideration definitely made me more curious about what the landscape of Red Rapture is going to look like, not just in terms of aesthetic, but mythology. So let's dive into Red Rapture's first volume and see how close Alexander came to accomplishing those goals, starting with the art. The artwork of Red Rapture is handled by Raven Maureen, and overall I have a kind of balanced like to dislike ratio for the art of the story. I don't want to say love-hate relationship because those are too strong of terms for this particular instance. Credit where credit is due though, it's commendable to fully color every single page. Raven's essentially doing double duty in that regard, since most manga or manga style projects are in black and white with the exception of splash pages, so the effort that has gone into Red Rapture is closer in overall style to a webtoon. There are also plenty of pages or panels where the framing is really interesting or does playful things that give it some extra personality. Like, while it isn't anything crazy, I really like the way this page is framed. The perspective, the color palette, and the simplicity of the background imagery to sell the tone of what Nagusa is reading is awesome. This kind of visually striking composition is on display at several points in this manga. And I will definitely say that the color work in Red Rapture is lovely at times. It's probably my favorite thing about the project overall. That is kind of where my praise for the art stops though. Let me preface this by saying I don't necessarily think the art is bad per se, but I do find it incredibly basic more often than not in a way that I think does hold it back. Don't get me wrong, there's some very good art in this project, but I think that it's spread out so much that it makes those panels or pages stand out more when compared to what's typically on screen. The character designs for the most part are also pretty bland in a way that doesn't really allow any of the characters to stand out, at least in the first half of the volume. There are legitimately two characters whose designs I love, being the primary antagonist and this character who shows up near the end. The problem is that Nagusa himself doesn't exactly stand out or give off primary protagonist vibes aesthetically. The facial art is also generic enough for most characters that it can often feel as though it's literally the same face template copied for everyone with very minor tweaks. A funny example of this being Nagusa's grandmother, who is supposed to be 64 years old, but in most panels she looks to be a mid-30s adult at most. There's occasionally a wrinkle, laugh line, or crow's feet to signal, hey, she's old. While the framing of a page can be cool, it's often just as basic as everything else so far when it comes to the perspective, the panel work, and so on. Structurally, it feels closer to a webtoon than a manga because there's very rarely any fluid panel flow. It seems more like it was designed for you to read while scrolling than to be read with the turn of a page. A bit of a nitpick is the backgrounds. While the color certainly helps it pop, there's something oddly off-kilter about a background that's present but slightly blurred. I'm sure this is done to minimize time spent drawing backgrounds, but I found it a bit distracting and it also fails to leave room for interesting environmental storytelling. In that same vein, so many panels have an abundance of negative space to the point it just feels like there was supposed to be more on the page or like there were things forgotten. That also does add to the issue of page flow. Like this page, there's so much negative space that could have been better utilized. The flow of the panels can also cause important details to go unnoticed, like this corpse right here. I legitimately did not see this on my first read because it was relegated to the background placed in dim light and the page doesn't flow in a way that organically leads your eye to it. A very simple fix would have been to simply bring the corpse into the foreground. There's more than enough space. And it's supposed to be indicative of the cruelty of this character. Another minor issue that I don't know if other people will pick up on, but I certainly noticed, is that during the action set pieces, the artist does seem to have a bit of a bad habit of breaking the 180 rule. If you don't know what that is, it's a cinematic principle that places a line between two characters during a scene. By keeping the camera on one side of this axis, it maintains the same left and right positioning of the characters, which preserves the order and flow of a scene. Jumping over this imaginary axis and flipping the left and right positions of the characters can be jarring for the audience when there's a lot going on. Lastly, and this is also a nitpick, I genuinely don't think it's necessary for the antagonist's dialogue to quite literally always be presented in black speech bubbles with scratchy red text. I think it's great for a character introduction or if something especially intimidating is being said, but when it's the default, it quickly loses its appeal and tension. Part of what makes the use of this style of speech bubble so effective is when it's used to signal to the audience a genuine threat, how terrifying a character or creature is, or how inhuman something is perceived, to the point it tangibly changes what we are used to seeing as a speech bubble. Because when this guy's default is the black on red, when the time comes, how are you going to convey the moment of dialogue when someone genuinely more dangerous comes along? You see what I mean? If everyone who's meant to be intimidating gets the red on black, it loses all meaning. Overall though, there is just as much to like about the art as there is to dislike, which is why I said it's a fairly balanced ratio. I think if Raven continues to develop their overall skill set, I don't see why they couldn't have a genuinely interesting portfolio of art under their belt from just this project alone. Just like with Hyperborea, it misses the mark in some ways, but the art has genuine potential as the artist continues to grow, and I look forward to seeing what that growth looks like in the end. The only thing that's truly missing here is a sense of consistency and quality. If you can shrink the disparity between the art on the best pages and the art on the not so great pages, I think that would be more than enough to get you to where you need to be, Raven, so please keep at it. Even though I did give you a bit of a hard time because I'm trying to offer constructive criticism, I do still tip my hat to you as an artist. You are still doing something that I for sure cannot do. The writing, however, to be completely honest, the writing is where I struggled the most with Red Rapture, because while the art isn't especially fantastic, it's got good bones. And even art that's fairly rough around the edges can still be elevated if the writing it's paired with is immaculate. A prime example of this are the original webcomics for Mob Psycho 100 and One Punch Man. The art's not incredible, but it was the story that took it to another level for everyone that liked it. Unfortunately, I think the writing is probably the weakest thing about Red Rapture for various reasons. I will have to go into heavy spoilers for Volume 1 of the story, so just bear with me. The immediate issue I ran into with the way the story is presented is that the entire first chunk, the first 17 pages, is an extended exposition dump. If we remove the 3 pages that aren't the story in motion, Volume 1 is 69 pages long. So a full 24.6% of this story is just the narrator yapping. Right out the gate, it commits the cardinal sin of telling you instead of showing you. And while many manga and webtoons utilize narrators to deliver exposition, it feels like skipping the line to get to the more interesting things. Though we know that this story is being told retroactively by Nagusa, it's still a huge gamble to rely so heavily on a future narrator yapping away instead of allowing us to just witness what Nagusa's life is like. We're told that his grandmother keeps him in check, we're told he questions the men who deliver sermons, we're told that he has a rivalry with a friend because they like the same girl, we're told that he's wise beyond his years for a 7-year-old, etc, etc. It's all stuff that we don't get to witness, but we're told to just accept as we're rushed along. Show us those things in action. Being told all of these things isn't a shortcut to characterization and leaves who's supposed to be our primary protagonist feeling kind of hollow as a character. We need to see a through line between how Nagusa thinks and feels alongside repeated behaviors or beliefs. It's up to the character and writers themselves to reinforce those traits so that we believe them. If you tell me that you're incredibly wise, sure, I heard you, but I won't believe you until you demonstrate that to truly be the case. However, I can see exactly where this issue comes from, and it's very similar to something I mentioned when reviewing Hyperborea. As Alexander noted in his blurb, Red Rapture was originally conceived as a light novel. For those who may not know, a light novel is a style of novelization that occasionally features anime-style art to supplement the story. Tons of popular anime and even webtoons began as light novels. I bring this up to say that Alexander is very likely used to novelization in terms of writing, and not necessarily scripting for a manga in the same way Ethan seemed to have some issues. It becomes clear that Alexander is used to having much more breathing room with describing a scene, whereas in this form of media, you need to allow the visuals to do a great deal of the heavy lifting, which means finding new ways to convey the information you want or need your audience to have. In a visual medium like this, that usually means finding clever ways to weave important information into naturalistic dialogue. An easy fix for this would have just been to follow what a normal day looked like for Nagusa. To keep the momentum going, that day could still remain his 7th birthday. That way we see what the baseline for his life is before things really pop off. It would also allow the audience to see him interact with the people that we're supposed to care about in meaningful ways. Stepping away from that though, a big issue I also had was how much terminology is tossed at the reader without any clear explanation. Occasionally we're given context clues, but for the most part it's a lot of words that are just glossed over because either the character already knows what it is, or the author knows what it is but forgets that we don't. I can't care about a world if I don't really understand what's being discussed. And sure, I'm betting a big part of that is the reveal to come as Nagusa is pulled further and further into this new adventure, but that reveal won't matter if you don't hook your audience with interesting concepts right out the gate. I also genuinely do not understand the magic system, which revolves around chi. It isn't explained at all in Volume 1, despite being something well known in this world. Understanding the rules of a magic system of a story, even on a basic level, is often a key element to hooking readers into wanting to see how those rules are bent or broken. But we get no real explanation at all, and it left me baffled. Even more so knowing that Alexander took inspiration from Naruto, Fullmetal Alchemist, and Avatar, all 3 of which make sure their respective magic systems are explained as early as possible while building on top of the set rules to add complexities or specializations over the course of the narrative. Like, there's a showdown towards the end of Volume 1 where the antagonist demonstrates the ability to manipulate Earth, so I'm like, oh okay, that's his thing, got it. But then he also demonstrates the ability to shoot fire. Okay, maybe people at his power level are special and can manipulate 2 elements. But then he also ends up manipulating water, so by now I'm thinking, okay, maybe his gimmick in general is the ability to manipulate all elements. I can rationalize that. But then, the guy he's facing off with uses his chi to generate a high-tech ninja suit with wings that can conjure wormholes to redirect attacks. So yeah, the magic system, in the absence of a rule set or explanation, just kinda seems all over the place, like children trying to constantly one-up each other in a game of rock, paper, scissors, where the kid that loses goes, these aren't scissors, this is a laser beam. The actual script itself is also not great. It's not terrible either, but it isn't going to blow you away or have you scrambling to know what comes next. I'm not sure if Red Rapture is Alexander's first attempt at a long-form narrative, but it does feel that way. There are also more than a few grammatical issues or spots where the sentence structure just feels a bit clunky. The dialogue itself lacks a natural flow and is often a bit too on the nose, or was just poorly executed in a way that made me laugh. Like this interaction between the antagonist and this guy. They square up and Homeboy says, "Fool around and find out." If you're going to have a character say something like that in order to sound tough, at least commit to having him say fuck. Just censor it, we'd all know what you were going for. But fool around and find out just isn't it. Before I move on, I also want to take a bit to really convey how irritating the twist at the end of Volume 1 is, and for that to happen I do need to talk proper spoilers because it all ties together. This is kind of a tirade, but it is an honest reflection of how I felt when I finished Volume 1, so just bear with me. It all starts with a character named Subira. The literal first scene we have of them together having a conversation, we go from this exchange of her saying she's not feeling well and would prefer to be at the library where she feels safer, to shouting "I don't want to die" in the very next panel. There's no discernible tension, there's no organic lead up to this outburst, it just happens. She's upset because she's awakened her gift and overheard her father attempting to sell her off because of that. Yet she immediately spills this incredibly sensitive information to a kid she isn't even sure will keep her secret for her? A kid we've never seen her have any kind of camaraderie with? Yeah, okay. Anyway, this causes Nagusa to attempt to offer her sanctuary at his home without his grandmother knowing. And when Maza does discover why the girl is there, she immediately flips her shit and is preparing to throw the girl out, much to Nagusa's dismay. The stress of the situation causes Nagusa's power to awaken, and when it does, Maza changes her tune instantly and is suddenly showing Subira compassion. But this flip leaves a bad taste because she only suddenly gives a shit because it's happening to her own grandchild. Which, by itself, wouldn't necessarily be bad in terms of the narrative, but we never got a real chance to see what Maza's beliefs are, whether that be her positives or her prejudices. She's not a real character, so her flip stands out as jarring and oddly convenient. Eventually, Maza contacts some unknown individual to ensure Nagusa's safety, which is what leads to the clash in the desert at the end because somehow, with literally no explanation, the antagonist not only knows where they are, but is hot on their heels. Anyway, the twist that baffled me and the reason I went through that explanation of events comes as the culmination of all these things. Turns out, despite taking Subira with them, Maza had only arranged for Nagusa and herself to be taken to safety by those she contacted, essentially leaving Subira out to dry. And the people there to secure them can't be bothered to intervene and protect Subira from the antagonist because the contract they're being paid to carry out only accounted for Maza and Nagusa, which again begs the question, why did Maza even bother bringing Subira along if she knew she hadn't arranged for her safe transport as well? At the last moment before the antagonist can take Subira, a transfer is made by Maza to alter the contract. Now, when I say the words "a transfer is made," most people will assume that the transfer in question is a money transfer, right? Like, Maza has transferred money to allow her leeway to alter the contract, right? That's what I thought too. But no, by transfer, they mean Maza transferred the protection the contract afforded her to Subira. Once the antagonist realizes this, he immediately takes his frustration out on Maza by using his earth powers to ensnare and crush her to death in front of Nagusa while the others just stand by and watch. There's just one major problem here. I don't give a single shit about Maza as a character. We've been given so little time with her and have seen so little of who she is that her death quite literally makes no impact on the reader. It's only here to be the big emotional loss moment for Nagusa, but there's no resonance with the reader because it wasn't earned. And while I was excited to see what kind of African mythology would be worked into the story, Volume 1 is surprisingly devoid of it. This surprised me because I honestly think that angle could have easily been the single most interesting thing to set it apart, especially considering the lack of similar representation in pop culture. Just look at how well received the character of Anansi was in the show American Gods. He was a fan favorite. So much of Red Rapture feels like it's trying desperately to tell an interesting story, but without having the patience to truly lay the groundwork. It feels like it knows there are more interesting things to come, so it's doing its best to speedrun its own opening. The promise that interesting things will begin happening next time shouldn't be the feeling that this left me with. The first entry in any piece of media is like a first date with an audience. If you don't make a good impression on the first date, there isn't going to be a second. And that concludes our time with Volume 1 of Red Rapture. I know I was very critical of this project, and I definitely didn't keep a balance of praise versus criticism, but this does all come from a place of good faith. The things that need improvement outweigh the things worthy of praise, but that's not to say that this project is unsalvageable or even bad. It's just kind of average with some edges that are rougher than others. I think if Raven continues on their trajectory and finds a level of quality that can be consistently maintained, they'll be okay. But the real sticking point here has to be an improvement in the writing. I think Alexander just needs a second pair of eyes, preferably from another writer, to look over drafts before pushing forward. As a writer, it's incredibly easy to get tunnel vision on your own projects, and it can sometimes take someone completely detached from the project to see something that you may have missed. As we saw with Hyperborea, the transition from novelization to manga isn't easy. However, I believe that with some adjustments to the approach of the art and fine-tuning of the script, there's no reason Red Rapture can't be as successful as it's aiming to be. The market for webtoons, comics, and manga is incredibly saturated and deeply competitive, so you can't afford to stumble out the gate. Audiences are fickle, and it seems like attention spans are just getting shorter and shorter, so you have to bring your A game right from the start. With all that in mind, in its current state, I think my final rating for Red Rapture is that it exists. I don't love it, but I also don't hate it. It's got solid potential, and I'm curious to see how it's going to pan out in the long run, so I will be keeping an eye on it. If you'd like to check out Red Rapture for yourself, there is a link to the product page in the description below. Like I said, how you feel about it may differ from how I feel it, so I do encourage you to still go read it. Well, that's going to do it for this installment of Indie Insight. I'll be back with another one very soon, where I'll be reviewing Volume 1 of Relentlessly Bullied Hero, written and created by Ken Virgil. Remember, if you're an indie creator that wants me to review your indie project, you can shoot me an email at the address on screen, and I will put you on the board. In the meantime, remember to take care of yourselves and others, stay cool and hydrated out there, and as always, thanks for watching.